Welcome to Forum 360 on Fusion, your PBS channel and your Rubber City radio stations. This is Leslie Ungar, your host today. Thank you for joining us on our global outlook with a local view. We all lived through it, for some of us barely, but we do understand the presidential election of 2016, or do we? What can be gained by understanding the primary process and the general election? Do we bury it or do we study it? It will probably come as no surprise that two professors at two of our area institutions for higher education decided to study it. Hillary Clinton was chosen as the subject of a class at Kent State University due to her long career in the public eye and her historical candidacy for President of the United States. The University of Akron chose Trump as the subject of a class because, well, he won. Dr. Suzanne Holt, director of the Women's Studies Program and professor in the Center for Comparative and Integrative Programs at Kent State, is teaching Hillary Clinton case study, Perspectives on Gender and Power. Professor Matthew Akers, director of Government Relations and assistant director at the Bliss Institute of Applied Politics, is teaching Trump's Triumph. This class focuses on Trump's rise during the 2016 presidential election. At the recent Oscars, host Jimmy Kimmel asked Americans to take a minute to reach out to one person, someone you disagree with, someone you like, and have a positive, considerate conversation. Not as liberals, not as conservatives, but as Americans. That's what we're going to try to do today as we look at a class on Hillary Clinton and a class on Donald Trump. Welcome to both of my guests, and thank you very much. And let me just note that you are sitting next to each other and have even had coffee together. So we can find some common ground as Americans, right?
Absolutely.
All right. So let's go back to the fall of 2016, which now seems like a million years ago. When did you first get the idea to create a class on a presidential candidate? Suzanne, I'll start with you.
Sure. It began to dawn on me pretty early in the primary season that we were in a kind of terrain that was practically a shout out for somebody to look a little longer, listen a little closer, and process what was going on. I suppose there may have been a layer of interest in Hillary as a presidential candidate way back in 2008. And I felt like we had failed to study that with the kind of depth that it deserved. So to my astonishment, when she announced her candidacy and the primary started to heat up, it seemed as if 2008 had returned, but with a vengeance. And perhaps because her candidacy was maybe a little more likely, maybe a little more calculated, maybe because we'd had time to ponder it a little bit, what had seemed almost casual relative to a kind of recurring sexism started to seem more conscious, more deliberate, a little more lingering in terms of its toxicity. So I would say it was arguably February or March where I started thinking someone should study this. And of course at that time, no one knew for sure that she was going to be the Democratic candidate, though I think a lot of people had used the word coronation. But I think what became clearer and clearer with every ensuing week was that this was defying theory. This was defying like predictions. This was in some ways a kind of defiant time that was challenging us to maybe set aside some of our lenses and try to see something
through some
for what it
different
was.
kind of lens.
And then I think the other thing that was occurring to me is not only was what was happening interesting, but the way we were talking about it and the way that it was being covered.
And we were consumed by it.
Yeah, it was almost like another layer on top. So the ground level layer, like the three-dimensional reality through which we were living was interesting, but the way we were talking about it just added another level of intrigue for me. So I definitely, to go back to what you were saying at the beginning, there was no question that I would study it personally, and I would propose it as a class to see if anybody else was willing to let me use that as an excuse to dig in with not only my interest, but with the interest of the students that wanted to have a similar enterprise.
Okay, so let's go back to perhaps the presidential primary, because you started out with, I like to say, 1,700 or 17. Pick your number of candidates, right? So was it during the primary? Was it during the general election? When did you first get the idea to create a class on this presidential candidate?
I really started paying attention to Trump, obviously, in the primaries, because it was interesting to me. He was articulating ideas that many of the other Republicans were not. And I said very early on, it's interesting listening to him on trade, on foreign policy, two areas where he was in disagreement with many of the other Republicans and would even get booed at times for pronouncements he would make. And so I was intrigued by him just because I enjoy listening to people who aren't just using talking points, and I thought, well, this is interesting. And I also knew that some of the positions that Trump was articulating, which again many Republicans even disagreed with, did have a history on the Republican side. So over the summer, as Dr. Holt said, I was also very intrigued, obviously, as we moved towards the general election, paying attention myself very closely. And I was teaching a course in the fall on American conservatism. And it was a small course at Akron. And the students that I had in the course were mainly Republican students or conservative students, but they were not fans of Donald Trump. And as we read a little bit more into the history of American conservatism, they got very intrigued by, again, some of the pronouncements. I remember one of Trump's pronouncements on NATO. We were reading about our own Senator Robert Taft from Ohio, who, as you might remember, was very much opposed to American entry into NATO. And it was simply at that point, not necessarily that you would have to agree with Senator Robert Taft or with candidate Donald Trump, but that these ideas that, again, both sides of the aisle were criticizing and saying, well, Trump is just saying this off the cuff and everything, was saying, well, it looks like there may be a little bit more to it than that. Again, just foreign policy is another issue that with his use of America First, we were reading about the America First Committee and the course on American conservatism, and they said this would be really interesting to study. And we were somewhat in agreement, though, but Trump is probably not going to win. So after the election, I very quickly said, I think I'm going to put this course together, partly around that idea of simply reading history to see that there is some historical precedent for a number of the things that Trump had advocated, but also because I knew both sides of the aisle. Again, obviously many Democrats or liberals were very upset by the election, would openly say, we don't know what happened here, why did this happen? But many Republicans also
said, we don't know what happened here.
We don't know what happened, right. So I really wanted to provide a course that would provide a historical background, but also some empathy with people who supported Trump, to say maybe they don't all have three heads, that there's some things that both sides of the political aisle, maybe some areas of agreement, actually. And so that's why we actually started out with Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance as our first book for the course, and I think that was a good start to the course. So it really happened back, I would say, immediately after the election that I actually said, since he won, let's go ahead and do this.
Let me ask you, and I'm just going to give you one word to answer this. If Trump had lost, would you still have done a class on the whole phenomenon, even if he had lost?
No.
If Hillary had won, would you still have done a class on gender and power?
I think that my strange, almost paradoxical fear was that if she won, we would presume that we didn't see anything we had just seen. That we would pretend that all was well.
And it was back to normal?
That was back to normal. So in some ways, the loss was, if this was the tragedy that a lot of people are now framing it, that was the right ending for the tragedy of Hillary Clinton.
So would you have done a class if she won and was the first female
We would have
president?
done a class. We would have. And in some ways, it wouldn't have been a terribly different class for me. I mean, I think that when I had first proposed the class, a lot of people were thinking that I was going to do some kind of like celebratory history class, like the first woman president. I never had that in mind. And to echo one of the themes that you had mentioned, Matthew, the idea of the people who were both supporting Clinton, who were opposed to Clinton, who were kind of in the middle trying to make up their mind. In many ways, though, the obvious two focal points are Trump and Clinton, the real story is about the people in so many ways in this election. And I think that was the story that became the most difficult for us to wrap our heads around. And I think it explains a lot of the three-headedness that was attributed to the Trump people and the sort of like devil or vagina voters that were attributed to Hillary. There was this inability for people to understand why the heck someone would.
On the other side.
Right.
On the other side. So in 2008, you had the first black president, African-American president. Was there a class at Kent or at Akron that studied that?
We do. I would have to go back and look. We do have a campaign battlegrounds class, as you know, that covers post-election, well, during the election.
So
and
you
sometimes
cover
also
most
post-election.
of the time you cover
yes, but
elections.
I don't know specifically whether or not that class existed at
wondered.
that time.
Okay. Several years ago, about every 4 years, I have Dr. David Cohn on about in January of the primaries, when the primaries start. And this was several elections ago. I remember that he said that America would not elect a Mormon. And he appears to be right. Is there any other category that you can identify that you would say America won't elect this? Or let me turn that around. In the next 3 or 4 decades, is it conceivable that America will elect a female?
I would say yes.
I would say not a feminist. I would say not an overt feminist. Unless it's a new framing of feminism that I haven't seen yet. So a woman perhaps, but I think not a feminist. Not until one of two miracles occurs. Feminism gets its act together and learns to market and package it in a way that makes it beneficial to all human beings. Or we simply have forgotten how much disdain we have for feminism as a culture. And I don't think at this juncture I've seen the level of disdain for feminism, both inside and outside. So I think that's definitely one category. I don't think we'll see another woman running as a feminist, and maybe not even a man running with a strong feminist agenda for a while.
Is there anyone that you would rule in or out as you look at the next few decades?
I really don't think so. In some ways, Donald Trump, of course, is a very unique candidate with a lack of professional political experience, at least, some may disagree, but at least a rhetoric very focused on the working class. I saw Trump also advocating two traits or themes in his campaign that have not gotten a lot of attention lately, populism and nationalism. And so I guess I would say that Trump himself is a very unique candidate this cycle. And so, yes, he doesn't have the characteristics that sometimes are celebrated in the media today, but nevertheless, he does have some ideas that are not popular in a lot of mainstream areas.
Well, let me follow that up. As a communication coach, I often say to my clients that you have to look at something and say, is it the exception or the rule? Because if it's the exception, you can't duplicate that. It's very difficult to duplicate that. Have you seen, or do you think you will see candidates trying to duplicate Trump? And as you just said, he was a unique candidate. Have you seen, either locally or nationally, candidates trying to replicate that? And do you think that would work for other people besides Trump?
I think his personality is uniquely Trump, so his ability to say things and get away with them, maybe that might be unique to Trump. But I think, again, some of the ideas that he's expressed are popular. We do have precedent. In my class, we've looked a lot at Pat Buchanan, for instance, 20 years ago in 1996. Buchanan, of course, then left the Republican Party and ran on the Reform Party ticket, actually against Donald Trump in the year 2000. But a lot of the same themes were present with Buchanan's campaign. I'll have later in the semester a gentleman come in from Youngstown to talk about James Trafficant, and so we'll look at a little bit of Trafficant's theories and compare those with Trump's.
Well, which he was actually a lot like Trump in that he was kind of the exception. I mean, he kept getting elected, but he was kind of the exception. I would think that if most candidates tried to emulate that, it wouldn't work well for most candidates. So how would you say that a candidate looks at something and decides what parts of that did he get elected because of, and what parts did he or she get elected in spite of?
Right. If I could just follow up on that with a course that I'm thinking about for the fall would be on nationalism and populism in the West. And so we'd look at, for example, Le Pen in France, some of the characteristics of political people in the West and Europe, to look at some of those same ideas. So I guess that's, I'm saying that a politician, if I were going to follow Trump today, I wouldn't necessarily try to follow his personality.
Right.
I would try to follow his policies on nationalism and populism, because I do think those, whether you agree or disagree, I think those are on the rise in the West.
And let me just take a moment to reintroduce our topic. We are looking at two area institutions for higher education, Kent State University and the University of Akron, that have both had a class on our candidates in our recent 2016 election. At Kent State, a class on Hillary Clinton, gender and power in politics, and the University of Akron, Professor Matt Akers and Trump's triumph. Did you want to add anything, Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, I think that those two themes are interesting in the respect that they are also indicative of a mood. One of the early, I guess you would call it a compliment or a critique of Trump, was that he had his finger on a pulse of America that had been neglected. And I think that there's some real truth to that you had 8 years of a presidency that really emphasized what it emphasized and operated in a space, and the people that were looking at that space were happy and content and in many ways comfortable and drifting off to a dream. And I think that meanwhile there was a kind of mood that was beneath the surface, easily felt if you tuned into certain publications or certain radio stations, or just even stepped outside your normal boundaries, that was there, always there. And I think that in some ways it was ready. I think that a lot of what we're talking about really is a context that had an energy that was waiting for the right guy to come along. And I think that in many ways it might have been a firebrand woman speaking those same themes. I think that in this country at least we probably have a greater opening for a heroic male. And I think that in some ways you also have a kind of strange set of opposites. You have two people that were very anti-Washington. I mean, Barack Obama was anti-Washington, kind of came in saying, like nothing good about Washington, and then you have Trump saying nothing good about Washington. So you had two people in a row, two guys sort of framed as loosely savior material that were going to, bring what America needed. And I think that the American people in each case had a kind of unmet hunger. I think the hunger that Barack Obama satisfied was kind of satisfied. I think that the hunger that Donald Trump met was completely just waiting for.
So let me ask you, because this is such a fascinating topic and time is going by so fast. I have an exercise I make my clients do. I call the walk across the room exercise, where you have to answer my question in the time it takes to walk across a room. So I'm going to ask you, out of all the theories about why Trump won and why Hillary lost, and there are many, if you had to pick one and answer in the time it takes to walk across a room, why, Professor Matt Akers, would you say that Trump won?
Two reasons: trade and foreign policy.
That was why you really got it in the time to across the room. And why, out of all the theories that are out there, pick one as to why Hillary lost.
I'm going to go with the unpopular theory of misogyny. I think that it's been there forever, and I don't know if you could really explain the kind of ferocity against a candidate that we saw with Hillary that was so tinged with that kind of particularity. And I think that, as close as the election was, that's kind of the unheralded element that nobody wants to talk about.
Now, I'm going to ask it a little bit different because your candidates ended a little bit different, okay? But if your magic wand worked and you could wave your magic wand and change one thing about the president or one thing about the non-president, Hillary Clinton, what would that be? Even though he won, we're going to look at quickly the first 7 weeks have been trying. So if there was one thing that you could change about Trump as president, what would that one thing be?
If we're talking about the first 100 days, or as far as we've gotten along there, I would say a more careful rollout of his policies. And again, I'm looking at it from the perspective of Trump supporters. And I'm saying I think that he has done a lot of what what he promised to do. Again, disagree or agree with that. He's rolled out a lot of things that he said he would do. But I think that as he's doing with this the second travel ban that was just announced today, I think he is starting to realize have to do things a little bit more carefully.
And if your magic wand worked and there was one thing that you could have changed about the candidate, Hillary Clinton, what would you have changed?
I would have had her come and sit down and talk with me for a couple hours and coached her on a few self-presentation issues.
Pick one. In the time it takes to walk across the room, pick one that you would have talked to her about.
To me, the biggest one is I think she is likable, and I think that she should have just said every time that came up is, "What are you talking about? People love me." I think I would have. I think if she had faced down her accusers and just said, "Untrustworthy, what are you talking about? Unlikable, what are you talking about?" I think she let that stay as the narrative, and I think that was a mistake.
And sometimes if we face something, it goes away. In one or two words, I'm curious if the passion that Bernie Sanders had on college campuses, would they have voted? If he had been the candidate, would those students that were passionate about him, would they have actually voted? I'm going to ask each one of you what you think, yes or no.
I would just answer from my class based upon anecdotal evidence, yes, because a number of them who supported Trump in the end voted for Trump actually were Bernie Sanders supporters who were upset that he was not the Democratic.
And in a couple words, as we wind down, would those passionate Bernie Sanders people, do you think that they would have still voted for Bernie if he was the candidate?
I think that they were having a kind of a born-again experience, to tell you the truth. I think for a lot of them it was a brand new revelation that they were interested in politics. So I think that he brought something to them that was like a profound, like, inner experience, something sort of quasi-religious. So I think they probably would have voted.
Would have voted. Now, my last question, in the time it takes to walk across a room, we look back at this 10 or 20 or 30 years, how will Trump have changed the Republican Party?
If he continues on the course that he's on, I think he may actually return it to an older style of conservatism, say a 1950s style Republican conservatism focused again on trade and foreign policy. I think his arguments against involvement in foreign trade alliances, as well as a more isolationist foreign policy, may take the Republican Party back to its roots.
And in 15 seconds, how will the loss affect the Democratic Party going forward?
I think its identity crisis has now come to full fruition, and I think that's a good thing. I think that it will have to resolve its identity crisis and figure out who and what it is.
Someone, somewhere, will be studying this election for the next 100 years or more. The Gettysburg Address was delivered 154 years ago, and we are still studying it. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech was delivered 53 years ago, and we are still studying it. Hillary went from being voted one of America's most admired women 20 times to the target of an unattractive mantra. Trump went from a reality TV boardroom to the Oval Office. Two area professors at two of our esteemed institutions have tried to help students and all of us understand Trump's triumph. Thank you to Dr. Suzanne Holt, Kent State University, and Professor Matt Akers, the University of Akron and Bliss Institute, for your contributions today. I'm Leslie Ungar. Thank you for joining us today on Forum 360 for a global outlook with a local view. Thank you.
Forum 360 is brought to you with support from Electric Impulse Communications, Kim and Harvey Nelson, Rubber City Radio Group, Acronist.com, Hudson Cable, Medical Mutual of Ohio, Forum 360 supporters, and the Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron.